Thank you very much. It's such an honour to be here. I have been to the State Library of Queensland a couple of times before as an author with the Brisbane Writers Festival. So I don't know if I think I've been in a debate in this room. I've certainly listened to some amazing speakers in this room. So it's a real honour to be here. So thank you for asking me. I also, having listened to that absolutely phenomenal welcome to country, I think it's the best I've ever seen. It was just so moving and atmospheric. I did also wanted to just make a very quick tribute to Chris Sara, who I've met on a number of occasions at public education forums and things, who some of you will know is an Aboriginal educator and also the past principal of Cherbourg High School. So when Ruchi mentioned Cherbourg, I immediately thought of Chris. So, literacy. I'm not a teacher. I lectured at university for 7 years, teaching a subject of intense academic rigour, advertising creative. So I don't claim to tell educators how they best teach literacy. My view is that is something that you know much better than I do, and as librarians and people working with young people in the area of literacy, you know much more about that than I do. What I can tell you a bit about is why literacy matters so much to me, and why I suppose my passion about literacy, which I think in the end leads to a life lived literally, a life lived with the enjoyment of books and reading, leads inevitably to a well-stocked mind. And I think one of the problems that we have in this society today is we've become so utilitarian. I was actually thinking a bit about Dickens the other day and Mr. Gradgrind and the whole utilitarian protest that he was making, I don't know, 150 or so years ago. And I wondered why it seemed to have come raging back onto the agenda. But it has. We now seem to look upon education no longer as something that is about developing the whole person, but in fact as something that is very different. And I would say that most of our political parties have their own very narrow view on what education is for. And the two of them really is, for the Labor Party, it's all about productivity. It's all about bringing people to work readiness and training them for jobs. That's a very utilitarian view of what education is for. And for, I would say, the Liberal Party, as far as I can tell by their policies, which is what I'm going by, yes, it's about productivity and it's about bringing people up to a point where they're employable, but it also seems to be about entrenching privilege and differentiating between groups of people. There's a lot of talk about excellence, which frightens me. Not that I'm opposed to excellence, but I'd like to know what you mean by the word when you use it. Personally, my greatest concern about Australia's education system is equity. Paradoxically, I was lucky enough to be in a presentation at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas a couple of years ago, at which the great Finn advocate for public education, Pasi Sahlberg, was speaking. For those of you who don't know Pasi Sahlberg, he used to run the Finnish education system. And he spoke about how in the 1970s, Australia and Finland were very similar in the way they approached education. But Finland decided to go on a journey where they made equity and children's well-being the central tenet of their education system. And then he showed us a PowerPoint. I'm a bit of an enemy of PowerPoint, I don't generally use it, but this, I have to say, was one of the most compelling pieces of PowerPoint I've ever seen. He showed us what happened to the Finnish education system in terms of competitive results with other countries via the PISA tests and OECD rankings over the 30 years that they had made equity and student well-being the centre of their education system, and it rocketed from down around the bottom to right up the top. And I think that's one of the things that we miss when we talk about education in these utilitarian times, and that is that the power of paradox and how often when you go straight at something. So we would talk about literacy and numeracy all the time. And yet what we're really seeing is a stagnation of literacy and numeracy at the top, and real gaps, huge gaps growing between our most literate and numerate students and our least literate and numerate students. I believe it's an average of 6 years difference for the very bottom and the very top, which is one of the highest in the OECD. It's marvellous, isn't it, what we've created. In Finland, it would be completely the opposite, and not only do their bottom do better, but so do their top, which is the interesting thing about improving equity. And of course, recognising that before children can perform well in school, they need to have a sense of well-being. Pasi Selberg actually has said that competition in classrooms creates fear, which has the opposite of the effect that we want with our children learning to learn, which is really what schools are about. It seems to me that a great many people today in Australia think that children are little vases that you just stuff with information, and that's what education is. And then you test them on that information, and the child that can regurgitate best is the cleverest. Why would we have got that idea about education's purpose, and also about that as being any measure of anything of value at all, the ability to regurgitate? I found it myself working at the University of Western Sydney and teaching a course called Advertising Creative, and I basically said, look, the only way to be any good at writing ads is to sit down and write them. So I gave them a brief every week, and that was our tutorial. They all had to read their ads and their solutions to the brief and critique one another and talk and see in front of their own eyes why something resonated better than something else. And for a lot of the students, this was extremely confronting. Every single semester, I would get great deputations of students asking me what I wanted, I wanted them to do, and my answer absolutely threw them, because I would say to them, I want you to do something and show me something that I've never seen before. This did not compute for many of them. It did for some. Somebody asked me the other day, which were the students that did well in advertising creative in this era? This very linear, tick the boxes, pass the tests, regurgitate the information that's been put into you. Which were the kids that did well? And interestingly enough, the kids who did well often surprised themselves, because they weren't the kids who usually did well. And it was because they kept inside them a bit of shit on the liver. They kept inside them just a subversive sense, a subversive refusal to be completely compliant. Our education system so rewards the compliant rather than the subversive. And I'm going to say something blinding generalisation now, but my belief is that all human progress has been created by the subversives, not by the compliant. If you think about it, it's fairly obvious. If you're compliant, you're satisfied with the way things are. You keep doing what you've always done. You comply with what other people tell you is the right thing to do. If you are subversive, when someone tells you to do something, your first question is why? Why should I do it that way? And you demand an answer. And if someone can't give you a reasonable answer, you might be encouraged to find another way. Now, all of my students wanted to pass the course because they needed the credit points, which was what I wanted to do when I was at university in the halcyon days when it was free. I wanted to get the credit points. They wanted to get the credit points, but they also didn't want to increase their HECS debt by failing a subject. So they were all absolutely committed to passing. Interestingly, they weren't necessarily committed to getting high distinctions, but they were very much committed to passing. So the subversive, and they were often subversive boys, interestingly enough, who had that, just kept that little bit of why should I in their soul, had two reasons to try a little harder and find within themselves the capacity to make a class, a tutorial of 25 students laugh out loud from a few scribbled lines on a bit of paper. That's a talent. That's clever. That's intelligence. That's something that's worth measuring. And they would get the kick of that and also realise that not only were they going to pass, but sometimes they got the first really high mark that they'd ever got in their university career. I can't tell you the number of them who would come up to me later and say, "Thanks for the good mark." And I'd say, "No, you did good work." But I valued those students because they'd kept that thing that will keep us moving forward, a refusal to be told and a refusal to obey. And we are breeding in a lot of our most privileged schools very compliant students, and I don't think it's a good thing. And worse, I had to do that bloody course 2 semesters for 7 goddamn years, and they used to bore the crap out of me with their ordinary, predictable, people-pleasing garbage. So I have a personal dislike of the compliance that they showed. My hope is in that subversion that remains amongst some of our young people, and hopefully amongst many of our older people too. I think I've got a fair whack of it. And I think it is of enormous value. And I think what we're seeing today, it's quite interesting. I mean, I was like everyone else, somewhat startled by the recent budget. But I've been really interested in the reaction to the budget, which has been so comprehensively negative, and from all sorts of people you wouldn't have expected it to have been negative. And I've wondered partly why that would be, because we do seem to be in a very harsh era in terms of people feeling any kind of compassion for the vulnerable. In fact, I think we're being trained to think that those who are vulnerable have brought it on themselves, and that there's some sort of virtue in being fortunate. But this budget's given a bit of a lie to that. The reaction to the budget has, I would say, been subversive, which I've really enjoyed watching. And I was wondering why, and I've got a couple of, just hypotheses as to why. The first is that I think everybody is feeling exhausted. How many people in this room feel tired and a bit overwhelmed most of the time? Yep, that would be a fair majority. And I think it's because basically what I've watched in my whole working life is a constant mantra, which is that nothing you do is ever enough. Nothing you do is ever good enough. I still remember so often working for businesses that were doing really well. They were making a lot of money. They were bringing in clients. Surely there should have been a moment at which we, as the people who were doing this work, should be allowed to celebrate, feel some joy, feel some pleasure in our success. But oh no, if we ever even looked like we're going to have a good time or feeling good about ourselves, the management seemed to think immediately that this was signs of imminent rebellion, and that we would simply cast our work aside and say that we would do no more. We would just rest on our laurels. How often have you heard people say, "Oh, you can't let them rest on their laurels"? Well, why the bloody hell can't you occasionally rest on your laurels? What is the point of having laurels if you're never allowed to rest on them? And I think this is the problem. We've never been allowed to enjoy our success. Think about Australia over the last nearly 3 decades. We've had 23 years of continuous economic growth. But are we having fun yet? So I ask the question. It's a subversive question. What's the point of it? What is the point of prosperity if it doesn't bring us any more ease? If it doesn't bring us a sense that we can do things which are about, hey, our well-being. If it doesn't bring with it a sense that we can give a helping hand to those who start out behind. We have never been more begrudging of things like public education, public health, public infrastructure. I remember when John Howard said famously some time ago when he first got into office and everyone thought it was a great thing, he said we need to have more of a user-pays society. I remember saying in an election to somebody once, you know what a user-pays society means, don't you? It means use pays. And basically I think that's what's happened. Particularly parents now are looking at a situation where they're going to have to support their adult children until they're at least 30. This is partly because either they're going to be at universities, you know, doing a course where they are, accumulating an unregulated debt of indeterminate amount. No one can seem to tell you how much it's going to be. So they won't be able to move out, get married, get a mortgage, do all those things that my generation were able to do, or if their children are not lucky enough, or even when they get to the end of their degree, if they're not lucky enough to get a job, they won't be able to get any unemployment benefits and will have to be supported by their parents. At the same time, the parents were told that they were going to have to work until they were 70. Feeling good so far, isn't it? Everyone's looking forward to it so much. And yet the government doesn't seem to understand what they were asking the population to do. My theory is that a lot of the lifestyle problems we suffer from, obesity, drinking too much, which goes along with obesity, lack of exercise, lack of children getting a decent home-cooked meal, is often to do with the fact that people feel they have to work incredibly long hours to keep their job, not to progress, not to get promoted, but so they don't get fired. And the terror that goes along with that is enormous. And the stress that goes along with that is debilitating. And one of the ways we self-medicate, and because we're living in a society where the other thing about being frightened of losing your job all the time is that you can't afford to be subversive. You have to be compliant. Because if you jack up or object, well, your card might get marked. You see how the insecure work environment actually creates a dumbed down set of workers because people are afraid. And fear, although it makes people work longer hours, doesn't actually make people work any better, as Pasi Sahlberg pointed out in the classroom. It in fact has the opposite effect. It makes them work less well. People need to feel a sense of well-being before they can do their best, or even well. And that's what's been leached out of the whole society, ridiculously, given that we're all so much more prosperous than we ever were. So we found ourselves in a neat little cleft stick, where we just get richer and richer and more frightened, and more miserable, and more afraid. And I've noticed a really interesting phenomenon, I don't know if you have. Well, there's a real tendency for the fortunate to blame the unfortunate for their misfortune. So if you ever speak, particularly on social media, as I do, about vulnerable kids, vulnerable people in general, you're told they're just lazy and they should get a job, as if they can just conjure one up. As if mental illness doesn't exist, as if depression doesn't exist, as if people don't get discouraged when, as Erica Betts is recommending, they write 40 applications for a job a month and get 40 rejections. What's that going to do to people? Does he even know what it is to be a human being? Or did they make him in some factory somewhere? So we've got this terrified population, and they are in control of themselves all day, really in a sweat of control all day, doing what they are supposed to do just to keep that job that keeps them less vulnerable than other people. And when they get home at the end of the day, they lose all control. And they drink too much, and they eat too much, and they watch too many back-to-back episodes of Law and Order, if they're anything like that. So we We're setting up to create the very problems that we complain about. I used to get asked sometimes when I was working in an advertising agency, and people would go, what do we do about childhood obesity? And there'd be, you know, we'd work for food manufacturers that were selling fatty foods to kids, and they'd be, I kid you not, they'd go, well, how can we do something about this because it's really impacting on our sales and our PR? And I would say to them, well, there's an easy thing you could do and you get great PR for it. And they go, what? And I'd say, just send every single one of the parents who works for you home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Do not allow parents to work in your office any longer than 4 o'clock. Because then they would have time to go home, shop properly for a good meal, cook it, spend some time with their kids, and even maybe play a game with them in the back garden or at the local park. And you could publicise it and say, well, you know, we're trying to do our bit for helping parents to help their kids. And they all looked at me like I was a crazy person. But it's sensible, don't you think? And it would have done their PR wonders. None of them did it. And that's another problem with a certain lack of emotional literacy. I think what our society is lacking in is not necessarily what we understand by the word literacy, but the idea of emotional literacy, an understanding of what it is that makes us human and how people in different circumstances respond, and why that needs to be taken seriously. And why it affects everything. So that we think we've come up with foolproof, you know, plans and ideas about how to fix the problems in society, and we find they don't work. And it's because we haven't taken people's emotional well-being into account, and therefore we are emotionally illiterate. Those subversive boys I was talking about, they were emotionally literate. They kept some of themselves alive. The very good students had killed a lot of themselves, their emotional selves, so that they could please others and progress. Horrible thing to think that's what success in education might actually lead to. But why do we blame the poor for their poverty? And this again, I think, is an example of our lack of emotional literacy. I've thought about it for a while because I don't like not understanding why things happen, or at least not having some hypothesis on why things happen, and I tend to mull over it till I come up with something that works for me. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just saying here's my take on it. It struck me that the idea that blaming the poor for their poverty was rather similar to that tendency we often have to blame the victims of sexual assault for their sexual assault. So we say to the young girl, well, or about the young girl who was sexually assaulted, oh, well, she was wearing the wrong clothes, she was drunk, she was in the wrong place, you know, she went out with him, you know, she went back to his room, what did she expect to happen? So we transfer the responsibility from the perpetrator to the victim. We also tend to do it when we find out that somebody we know, or who is an acquaintance or whatever, has a life-threatening illness. We will come up with reasons why that person got the life-threatening illness. Often the first question someone will ask when someone says so-and-so has cancer is, did they smoke? So we want to know the reason so that we can hook a reason onto that person. Oh, and if they die from their life-threatening illness, there's a tendency for us, not all of us, but for a lot of us, I've heard it many times, to say they didn't think positive enough. And to almost, or they say they had a cancer personality. So they almost blame them for their misfortune. Well, why do we do that? And I think the reason is this. It's to maintain our own illusion of safety, of our own exceptionalism. So in other words, we can say to ourselves about the girl who was raped, because often the most judgmental are other young women. So we can say to ourselves, or those young women can say to themselves, well, of course, I would never be in that place. I would never go to that room. I would never wear that kind of clothing. I would never behave like that, so I will never be sexually assaulted. I retain my illusion of safety. In the case of the cancer sufferer, we can say, well, I don't smoke. I don't have a cancer personality. I am a very positive person. This would never happen to me. I am safe. And I think now in this society we're saying to ourselves, well, because I work really hard and I've got a good education and because I do the right thing and I will never fall through the cracks and be poor. And the more frightened we are of our situation, the more unsafe we feel, the more rigid our need to maintain our illusion of safety. So fear kills compassion. Because if you think about it, if you can other the people who are suffering and say, that would never be me, they're not like me, you don't have to feel any compassion for them because they're not like you, they're different. So the fear, the undercurrent of anxiety, which is in all of us, and which suits a lot of the people who run our society, well, they think it suits them. It tends to blow up in their face quite often, like every election. We ramp up our illusion that we're exceptional, that somehow we'll be safe. And that's my hypothesis on why the increasing need to blame the unfortunate for their misfortunes. And the problem is, in Australia, we're right out there in the lead on increasing the ability of our young people and our population to have the keys to the kingdom, which is literacy and numeracy, which is the ability to negotiate what is becoming increasingly an information-led world. We have one of the biggest gaps, as I said, in the OECD between our highest and our lowest performing 15-year-olds. We call it the stubborn long tail. Those stubborn children, why don't they just pick their game up? Well, maybe it's got something to do with the fact that we're the third lowest funders of public education in the OECD. I'll repeat that again. We're the third lowest funders of public education in the OECD. I believe only Chile and Belgium are worse. Chile, interestingly enough, are currently putting legislation through their parliament to end all subsidies to private schools. So pretty soon we might be the second lowest funders of public education in the OECD. Where I think we're either the third or fourth highest public funders of private education in the OECD. But we don't seem to be able to realise that these facts have any connection whatsoever with the increasing gap between our highest and our lowest performing students. I would have thought that connection was at least worth investigating. Indeed, the Gonski Review did investigate it. Many of you will be familiar with the Gonski Review. It's terrific and not perfect, but it's much better than what we've got presently. And it was specifically about trying to bring the bottom up by giving those kids who need most more. Instead, as we currently do, we just give those kids who need least more. Which, quite apart from the social justice of the thing, which is appalling, is an incredible waste of money. Why would we go around giving large subsidies to students and schools that are already luxuriously resourced, already doing incredibly well on every measure, and where their fees go up by more than the rate of inflation, an average of 5 times the rate of inflation every year, despite the public subsidies they receive? So all that money we've been given hasn't increased access to anyone, hasn't increased results because they're already doing well. All it's really done is, it hasn't broadened the access, it's narrowing. There's more and more of the same sort of kids going to those schools. What it has actually done is we've created a publicly funded arms race where the very elite schools have to present ever more luxurious facilities to compete for the high-worth parents who can afford the fees to send their kids there. And that's what we're doing. We're just ramping up these extraordinary facilities on offer to a very few, which is fine. I don't mind them having those facilities, but unfortunately it doesn't actually do anything for their education. Just recently, Barbara Preston came out with some more figures which showed again that kids from comprehensive public schools outperform both their private school and selective school peers at the end of their first year at university. So it's not that I'm envious, because whenever you put the case for anyone who's doing it tough, you're told it's the politics of envy, which I've never understood. It's not that I'm envious, I think it's a hideous waste of money. And as we're supposed to be in dire straits, maybe we should save some of that money. I'm just putting it out there. But you guys are in the library business. And you guys, like everybody else, are facing all the changes that are happening in the world. The changes that I think are probably making us all feel under threat and so highly anxious and so less able to be compassionate, that are driving the people who have the levers of employment and business and government and policy to insist that we all work longer, harder, longer, harder, longer, harder, and so forth, get exhausted. You're dealing with all the same things everybody else is. I do a lot of speaking with a lot of different sectors, and people always think that the things they're struggling with are unique to their sector. They're not. They're the same for every sector. You're particularly under attack because of social media, because suddenly, at the end of my smart device, is every library in the world. I write historical novels. If I want to find out a fact, I put in, when did Catherine de Medici die? Up it comes, in an instant. 20 years ago, if I was going to write these novels, I'd be sitting in the library every day. I'd be taking down books, I'd be researching. It would take me a lot longer to write. So these things are impacting directly on you. But what I want to say to you, I had to speak last year at the Publishers Conference. And if you think libraries are undergoing changes, you should go to the Publishers and the Booksellers Conference. That was the other one, the people who own the bookshops. Oh my God. But I don't think either of those things, all libraries will die. I don't think that what we're going through will kill any of those things. I think there will still be bookshops, I think there will still be paper books, I think there will still be publishers, I think there will still be libraries. But what I ask them and what I want to ask you is a slightly subversive question. You need to know what business you are in. Lots of booksellers think they're in the business of selling books. They're not, and they never have been. Perhaps librarians, lots of librarians think they're in the business of lending books or having books on shelves as a resource. You're not, and you never have been. Lots of publishers think they're in the business of just publishing paper books. Well, none of them do that anymore, but they're not, and they never have been. The thing to think about is what business you're actually in. And now I'd like to show you a short clip, which I think is from one organisation that knows exactly what business they're in. Some of you may have seen this ad before. Can we play it now? Maybe drop the lights too.
This isn't right. The 3 little pigs are the victims.
We down 2 houses.
We've got away with it.
But the pigs are too far.
Bringing someone alive hardly constitutes reasonable
Somebody is
force.
going to bring the lion and intrude on
Yeah,
you.
protect yourself and your
If someone tried to blow my house down, I'd do the same.
I knew the wolf. There's no way he could have blown down those houses. He had asthma.
The wolf had asthma. So what's the truth about the pigs' houses being blown down? Inside job.
There's no reason why those 2 houses, one made from straw, the other from wood, should have collapsed. Not even a healthy wolf's huff and puff could bring them down.
3 little pigs have confessed to conspiring to commit insurance fraud, framing the wolf in an attempt to cover their tracks. Their motive was financial. as they struggle to keep up with their mortgage repayments.
Guilty. Empathise with the
I've
things
got that on my payments too. I just
that happened.
lost everything.
Phenomenal ad. I just love it. But the great thing about it is The Guardian knows what business it's in. It's not in the business of selling newspapers. It's in the business of informing the public, starting conversations, getting people discussing things. It's in the business of ideas. You're always in the business of what the benefit is to the end user. So in other words, when I talked to the booksellers in particular, I said, you sell a book. What does a book deliver to the person who buys it? It doesn't deliver paper and covers. It delivers escape, information, imagination, story, narrative. It delivers experiences. It delivers empathy. It's fiction. Is how a lot of people learn to imagine themselves into somebody else's situation, someone else's point of view. It delivers always dialogue because the printed word is always a conversation. Even the spoken word, even though at this moment you're silent and I'm speaking, is a conversation because you're making of my words something different in each of your heads. So it is with a novel. The novel is only half written until it's read. Then it's fully written, but it's a completely different book for every reader. That's the great strength that books have over film, for example. My kids read the Harry Potter trilogy before there were Harry Potter films. So they cast Harry and Hermione and Ron Weasley, and they designed Hogwarts, and they decided what a Quidditch game looks like. Every child who reads it now sees Daniel Radcliffe, sees Emily Watson, sees the art director and the director's vision of Hogwarts and everything else. That's fine, but they've lost something. My kids had something they haven't got. So in libraries, you are in the business with booksellers of experience, imagination, but also resource and also escape. Both escape through whatever it is that they're reading, but also escape, it seems to me, from the hurly-burly, from lots of people. And particularly, it seems to me, the opportunity is for those who are being left behind. Once upon a time, kids would go to the library if they lived in overcrowded households, if they wanted to do their schoolwork, and there were too many brothers and sisters and they had no bedroom of their own. The quiet place to do their schoolwork was at the library. Now, what about those kids who don't have a computer at home or can't get access to it because mum's got to work on it or dad's got to work on it or whatever? You've got those facilities for those kids who can't get anywhere else, and it's no use asking our public schools to do it. They don't have any money. Those little Lenovo things were pretty useless anyway, and they've stopped the program. It was a short-term program. Now it's bring your own device to schools, which is fine if you have your own device. And we're forgetting about those kids that don't have their own device or don't have one that can work well enough and also don't have a quiet place. There are so many things libraries can offer, but you need to think of what business you're actually in. And you're probably, in the end, in the business of knowledge and learning to learn. And as an undemanding place to do that. In the classroom, somebody's writing you. In the exam room, in the university, somebody's writing you. The great thing about a library is nobody's writing you unless you talk too loud. So I think that what we're lacking in our society today is so many things that are so important, but most of them to do with emotional literacy. And I think it's now subversive to recommend that we continue to value those things, and perhaps libraries could think about this. Things like fun. Things like lollygagging and not doing anything productive. Just dreaming and playing and being silly, which is of course where every child learns the most they ever learn in their whole life, when they are being in their imagination rather than in a classroom. Decency, generosity, empathy, public, the commons, the things we have in common that everyone has access to. I was lucky enough once to be on a panel with Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the internet, and he was the guy who at the British Olympic Games, the opening of the British Olympic Games, typed up for everyone to see come up in lights, "It's for everyone." And he's on a worldwide mission to stop governments censoring or restricting access to the internet. He invented it to be for everyone. So we enter this world of privatisation, of competition, of very hard and I'd say inhuman values. There is an equal and opposite force doing exactly the opposite. And those of you who work in areas which are in common, where everyone has access, where everyone has a right, just in their own right as a citizen or a resident of this country, remain precious and important. And I think valued, because it's become so rare not to have to pay. I remember once when I was struggling with my eldest daughter and having a terrible time with her, she was biting. I mean, she was only 4, but she was biting. And everyone panics when a kid bites. And so I took her to this Hercules Street Family Centre near where I live in Sydney. And when I left, I said, "How much is it?" And they said, "It's free." And I nearly burst into tears because it made me feel so supported. That my community, my society, my neighbourhood actually cared whether I was a decent mother or not, regardless of whether I could afford to pay for the service or not. I don't even know if that service still exists, but I remember clearly how it felt to be told, "Oh no, it's free, and you're as entitled as anyone else." I don't want to lose the value of that. I think the most subversive thing in the world now is to be a supporter of the things we have and hold in common with anything with the word public in front of its name, including that most vital of all things, public toilets.
Listening and taking it down. I was wondering particularly around the private public schools business, because when you talk about those figures, a lot of those smaller church-based schools who do get funding, are you piling them in together?
Well, the point is this: in most of the rest of the world, if you are a private school, you don't get public funding. Yes. If you are, for example, in New Zealand, the Catholic schools are part of the public system. In the UK, they're part of the public system. What that means is they cannot pick and choose who they will accept or who they won't accept. They don't have special privileges. Here, what we've done, very, very foolishly, is we've really given one system all of the responsibilities. So only the public school system has to shoulder the responsibility, for example, for the compulsory education of all school-aged children. The private schools take no responsibility for that, nor do they have to. And yet they receive public funding. So even the smallest systemic Catholic school, which may do a wonderful job, be a lovely school, does not have to take that responsibility and can and does pick and choose who they will educate, and the public school down the road doesn't have that privilege. And then we do that double whammy where we condemn the public school for doing the heavy lifting. We say, "Oh, those kids are..." Well, they're not, they're kids. And, you know, if we want to be a democracy, all our children need to be educated. And to then doubly punish the public schools because they take them on, and then to starve them of the funds they need to do that job properly, is so wicked on every level that until, my position is this, and it's an angry one, and it's a subversive one, is until every public school has the money they need to do the job they have to do for the kids that they are asked to educate, I'm not interested in the private schools and the schools that get to pick and choose. They've got the easy road.
Here's a subversive idea. What about if kids in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, chose not to go to school, but chose to go to their local libraries and to read and think and play and be there, and went to schools or those edifices that were schools really just to play?
Who knows what will happen in 10 or 15 years' time, but I will say this. I think the most important lessons that are learned at school are not the curriculum. Everyone goes on and on about the goddamn curriculum as if it's the fountain of wisdom. It's just what they practice on. Think back to your own school days. Mine were 40 years ago this year I left high school. Do you remember anything from the curriculum? Really? Or do you remember the teacher you loved? And the fun you had with your friends, and or the person who bullied you or was nasty to you, and how you had to work out how to deal with that? What getting kids together with their peers does, and I would hate to see us lose this, is it first of all it teaches them a very important thing, that they are no more or less special than any other kid. Whereas if you stay home with mum and dad, you are the special one. Well, in a class of 25, you are not, and that's a very good lesson to learn. It also teaches you how to deal with difficult people, how to make friends, how to be emotionally literate. We go on and on about mean girls. There's a lot of, girls are so awful at school to one another, such bullies, and, boys just fix it with a thumb, as if that's a good thing. And I keep thinking to myself, yeah, but girls are learning how to do relationships. So of course they get it wrong, but it's a great thing they're doing. They're learning about relationships. Whereas fixing it with a thumb means you're not learning about relationships. And we see the consequences of that in the one woman a week who is killed by her partner in Australia today. So let's not criticise the mean girls. And that's what schools for. Schools to teach you how to live with your generation.
Questions? Yes, there's one up there. Thank you. Just identify yourself so Jane knows who she's talking to.
Thank you. Emma Spellman from Brisbane City Council Libraries. I was really interested in what you were talking about with regards to the fear and the distance people have for victims in our society today. And I think we often hear rhetoric about us not having a compassionate society. There is one school of thought that I'm very interested on your ideas on, and that is that we have become very, our compassion is exhausted, and we have, if you do have a family member who has cancer, there is 1,000 charities that you can give money to, there's 1,000 places you can invest your energy. Where do you go and where is it best used? And there is a school of thought at the moment that people are just saturated by how they can help and they don't know. So it's more that they're feeling impotent in the situation of how to proceed rather than and what to do. Do you think there is a need for regulation of the third sector of some sort, or some level of condensation of what is currently the vast area in that field?
I don't know about regulation and condensation, because it seems to me that if people have a passion to do something, we shouldn't discourage them from doing it. And whether they succeed or fail is really up to them. But I think part of the problem is we mistake compassion with the desire to fix the problem. And we have this idea that we should just be able to fix it. Why can't we fix it? And then move on. And if I can't fix it, well, why should I feel any more compassion for you? I tried. But that totally misunderstands what compassion is. Compassion is actually recognising that the human condition is not fixable. And therefore, to want to find a fix is not actually about the person you say you're being compassionate to. It's actually about you, because this problem is annoying you or making you feel bad in some way, and you'd really like it just to be fixed and go away. Compassion is actually about understanding that if someone's mentally ill, they're probably going to be bloody difficult to deal with a lot of the time. If mental illness was easy to deal with, it wouldn't be the problem. It is. So compassion is about saying, I'm going to sit with the fact that this person, who I may love or I may not be able to stand, is going to be a difficult person in my life. And I don't need them to fix it so that I don't have to deal with their difficulty. So I think we misunderstand the meaning of the word compassion. And therefore, when people talk about compassion fatigue, they're not talking about compassion fatigue. They're talking about
fix-it fatigue.
Fix-it fatigue. Those people won't get better, and that annoys me. Well, I don't give a shit.
Question. Oh, okay.
Stunned into silence.
Yeah, I've got one more. And I hope it's not a political question, but we do, and I'm not sure if we do, but we seem to have, with the manufacturing industry closing down, we seem to have a shrinking tax base, which means that if we're going to do all the things that we should know as a society, we do need young people to be employed. And I get that if we have schools that work better, that will happen. I guess I've just took myself around to your public debate, to your public school debate, haven't I?
You can't ask for more productivity while starving the schools that are dealing with the kids who started out with less. It's no logic to it. It makes no sense.
Okay, there is one there. Thanks.
Jenny Nichol of the State Library. I work front of house, so I see every day is different. Now, I was brought up in a rural community where we all cared, and I grew up. There was a number of widows when I was a child, and we all looked after each other. We all, everyone knew everyone in a small community, and we cared. And if the kids stepped out of line, it wasn't always our parents that pulled us into line. And so I was fortunate enough to have a community that cared. Now, Brisbane is a beautiful city to live in, and people are still have that care and compassion here, a lot compared to a lot of the bigger cities in Sydney and Melbourne. We are a lot, I can say we are fortunate enough that we still give a damn. Now, there are a lot out there that will give money to a whole lot of organisations, but they won't step out and talk to their neighbour or actually help someone in need on a one-on-one basis. Do you think there should be more involvement, like it's hard, we all lead busy lives, but I think we need to give a damn about each other to help our children, in their future learning needs.
I'll speak up for Sydney. I live in an area where there is this really strong sense of community. We all know each other, and we have a street Christmas party every Christmas, and everybody comes, and the kids, a lot of the kids have grown up now and moved away, and they all come back for the street Christmas party because they feel very much part of the community. So there are cities within cities and communities within all different places. You find community in all sorts of places. But I think you make a very good point, but I think exhaustion is one of the reasons that people don't step out and talk. They don't have enough emotional resource left for themselves and their own family, and so they find it really demanding to feel, particularly the lonely old lady next door who just wants to talk and talk and talk, and you're absolutely done in. I've been guilty of this, and thinking, I just can't. And so energy and energy depletion, I think, has a lot to do with people finding it hard to do that giving a damn. But I also think, and I'm sorry, I sound like an old Swiss watch going on about a particular thing, and there may be some truth in this. I do think one of the reasons, for example, in my area of Sydney, there is a really strong community, is that all the kids went to the local public school within walking distance and within an easy bus ride. And there was a dedicated school bus, and we'd all meet every morning at the school bus stop with our kids in tow, and then we'd hang around afterwards and talk, and we'd get to know each other, and then, we might have a barbecue on a Friday night, or, so there was that build-up of community around a community public institution. In this case, the school, but it could be another institution in different places. I think in a lot of country towns it's something, sometimes it's the local sporting complex or the swimming pool or whatever it is. And that's what we've lacked, because a lot of people now, they not only do they work every hour, God sends, but they drive their kids. I mean, across the
city to take them to some fantasy, fabulous school. And you can see it. Look, I mean, I don't know if it's as bad in Brisbane, but in Sydney, with the school holidays, there's no goddamn traffic. It's absolutely fantastic. Imagine the climate change we would affect if we just sent our kids to the local school and they walked and rode their bike there. Their community would improve, our community would improve, their fitness would improve, and we'd be putting less carbon in the atmosphere and we'd have more time. We've been led up the garden path, let me tell you.
There's a question over here.
Hi, I'm Susan King. I'm from Arts Queensland. I also work as a client manager for the Footpath Library in Queensland. I've just got a question for you. I don't really know where it's going. Let me start. I read an article some time ago about an area, I think it was Nevada in the US, where they were spending an awful lot of money on caring for people who are homeless and suffering from all sorts of issues. So what they did was they looked at all the figures and they said, you know what, let's just put them in essentially public housing. So they had this apartment block, they fitted it out, they had like a halfway house, someone there the whole time, dealing with all of their issues, their addictions, falling over in the street, having to be nursed back to health, everything. They trashed it, they just replaced everything. The way that they had to try and sell it, the pilot project, was that it was cost saving. It was costing them less to give these people housing and facilities and assistance than it was to let them live on the street. The big issue was people didn't feel that they deserved it. So how do we get past that with social justice being about warm and fuzzy and being about, do we need to frame it so that it's budget savings?
Yeah. But even when we do that, Julian Burnside has put forward a tremendously incontrovertible case about how much less it would cost us if we just had onshore processing, took the boat people, than it does to do all this, you know, unbelievable, ridiculous, tie ourselves into knots. So it isn't really about cost. That's the excuse we use. That's the rationalisation for our emotion of fear, whatever it is. It's almost always we don't want the other because we're frightened of something, of losing something. So we give ourselves a rational explanation, oh, it's about the cost. But it's funny how we can find the money for the things that those in charge want to do. It's never about the cost then. So I always see that as a rationalisation. There are lots of things that are starting to happen. I think in Queensland there's some things that are going on. I think there's a consortium of people, one of whom is the Benevolent Society, and what they're doing in very disadvantaged areas, and this is a terrific idea, is they're putting in the public school, they're making a kind of a welfare hub. So they've got things like the Baby Health Centre system, the prenatal classes, the local GP, you know, so that they can start to make connections with mothers before they have the baby, because we know, for example, that if you can work with mothers at risk or pregnant women who are at risk of having a marginalised and disadvantaged child, and we pretty much know who they are, and help them with their parenting skills before they have the baby, that the improvement in that child's the vocabulary, development, all those things is absolutely huge. And there is some movement in that direction. Things like having a coffee shop for the mothers so that they can gather and talk to one another as well. All these things are really smart and they save us so much money in the future. It's just not funny. We know it's $1 to 7, isn't it? With early childhood investment and prenatal investment. We still don't do anything like that. Look at what we're doing with childcare right now. The Productivity Commission looking at childcare. The Productivity Commission looking at childcare. Could I just repeat what's wrong with that phrase? As if children and childcare are still about productivity, not about humanity. We have to get over this. We really have to get over this. The logic is incontrovertible. We still won't do it. And I'm absolutely sure, I'm looking at the future. This no dole for anyone under 30, you can't get a job. The irrevocable result of that is, if I was a smartish under 30-year-old who couldn't get a job, I think I'd start dealing drugs, wouldn't you? It's the easiest thing. It's market forces in the raw. It's absolute entrepreneurialism. It's where the opportunities are, and it's what they can do. and there's no job interview, and you go off the tax system and off the grid. It seems to me that it's like they're standing there begging them to do it. People aren't thinking, they're not thinking, they're not thinking because they're not empathising. And they're not empathising because they're saying those people over there are different from me, and they're different from my kids. And unfortunately, I think the gated communities that a lot of kids are educated in, I'm sorry, private school is a gated community, leads them to think those kids aren't like me. I've never met those kids. I don't know anything about those kids. I went to a comprehensive co-ed public school in a middle-class suburb in Sydney, and we had kids there from the Housing Commission to, the doctors' kids and the real estate agents' kids and the lawyers' kids. We didn't know what your father did. We were just friends with each other. That's gone. We don't have that anymore, except in a few country towns. And interestingly enough, those schools do really well. So we've kind of outsmarted ourselves into a segregated, cold, frightened of our neighbours community. And I don't know what for some spurious excellence that no one's ever defined, and a spurious productivity which doesn't make anyone feel any easier, safer or happier. Oh, call me crazy, but I'd like to know what the benefit of all this is. I'd like to know where we're going and why we're going there before I'm going to buy a ticket.
Last question and then we must finish. Oh, quick, well, make them quick.
Hi, Louise Bauer, Sunshine Coast Council. We were talking earlier this morning about libraries and conscious competence in the literacy space. I'd be interested in your views on how to encourage subversive thinking over compliant thinking in the context of public libraries stepping up into that learning space, also in the context that we're working directly with communities.
So hard. It's like with public school teachers and principals who are the loveliest people you've ever met in your life, but they're very good at obeying rules. Because, of course, that's part of their training. And I think people who have a sense of public commitment and public service are often quite, they're good people. And so they're often very nice. And so it's hard to get that subversiveness happening. I am seeing it, though, in the strangest places. I absolutely love the Lock the Gate Alliance. There was a question on Q&A last night, I don't know if you saw it, from a really, almost your stereotypical cast from an ad farmer to Barnaby Joyce. That was absolutely going Barnaby Joyce, and I thought it's terrifying, the Liberal National Party, these sorts of people. And I've heard the stories of the knitting grannies. Have you heard about the knitting grannies? Best people on earth. And that's subversion, because nobody knows how to deal with them, because they're so out of the box. I used to want to say to people who did feminist marching or anti-war or anything else, if you're going to be really effective, you should wear a suit and a tie, and you should look nothing like what they expect you to look like. That's subversion. People that, even the so-called radicals are compliant. You've got to have those dreadlocks or you're not really a feral. Oh, stop it. How unoriginal can you be? And also, you're reducing your effectiveness because people go, that guy's an idiot. So, even if he isn't, that's their assumption. So, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think subversion is completely different things depending on what the norm is. And it's just standing back and saying, well, how could we do this differently? I'm very fortunate. I spent 30 years in advertising. My training was, how do you do this differently? How do you get people to pay attention to something they have no interest in and don't want to pay attention to it? There's only one way, do it differently. Who knew that that was going to turn out to be very, very useful training later in life?
Jane, I'm going to interrupt you for this final question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Talia. I'm just a student.
Just a student.
My question is, considering your background in advertising and how much advertising capitalises on fear, do you think there is a role for advertisers to reduce the fear society feels?
Good question, but they never will. Hope and fear are the only ways you change behaviour. We call them the carrot and the stick in other circumstances. So yes, but advertisers use both. They use hope and fear. But you'll never change that. The behaviour modifiers of those two emotions will continue for as long as there are human beings on the planet. The reason being, they're the only two emotions that change behaviour. The reason for that is because they're the only two future-oriented emotions. So you look at the future with a sense of anxiety and dread, you're in fear. You look at the future with a sense of hope and excitement, you're in hope. And that's what advertisers and communicators and politicians and parents and teachers and teenagers and employers and employees and absolutely everybody uses all the time, including you.
And on that profound piece of wisdom, please would you thank Jane for